The morning of February 25, 2005, began like any other in Park City, Kansas. Birds chirped in bare winter trees. Coffee brewed in quiet kitchens. Children waited for school buses that never seemed to arrive on time. But for one man, this ordinary Friday would mark the end of a double life that had terrorized an entire community for over 3 decades. Dennis Rader, respected church council president man and meticulous compliance-devoted family officer, had no idea that his morning routine of checking municipal violations would be interrupted by handcuffs and the weight of 10 murder charges. For 31 years, the residents of Wichita had lived with a ghost, a phantom who called himself BTK, short for bind, torture, kill. He moved through their neighborhoods like smoke, selecting victims with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a predator. He wrote letters to police, taunting them with details only the killer could know. He vanished for years at a time, leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. But Dennis Rader wasn't a ghost. He was their neighbor, their colleague, the man who enforced city ordinances with obsessive attention to detail. The same attention to detail he brought to murder. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The story of BTK doesn't begin with his first kill in 1974. It begins decades earlier, in the mind of a boy who learned to associate power with suffering, control with death. Dennis Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the eldest of 4 sons. To anyone watching, his childhood appeared unremarkable. Average grades, quiet demeanor, a family that attended church regularly. But beneath the surface of this ordinary American boyhood, something twisted was taking root. By his own admission, Rader developed fantasies about domination and torture while still in elementary school. Not the typical childhood games of cops and robbers, but elaborate scenarios where he held absolute power over life and death. He would later confess to hanging stray animals, watching them struggle, studying their final moments with the detached curiosity of a scientist. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were experiments, lessons in control that would eventually graduate to human subjects. The Rader family moved to Wichita when Dennis was young, settling into a community that prided itself on Midwestern values. Hard work, neighborliness, faith in God and country. Dennis learned to navigate this world with careful precision. He understood that his inner thoughts needed to remain hidden, locked away behind a mask of normalcy that would serve him for the rest of his life. At Riverview Elementary School, teachers described him as withdrawn but polite. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't draw attention to himself. This ability to blend into the background would become one of his greatest assets as a killer. While other children played and laughed, Dennis watched. He memorized faces, noted habits, cataloged weaknesses. Even then, he was learning to hunt. The fantasies grew stronger as he entered his teenage years. He would later tell psychiatrists that he spent hours imagining scenarios where he could act out his darkest impulses without consequence. He drew pictures of bound figures. He wrote stories that ended in death. But he also learned something crucial during this period. He learned to compartmentalize, to separate the monster in his mind from the person everyone else saw. In 1965, Dennis enlisted in the United States Air Force. Military service took him away from Kansas, giving him new environments to explore and new people to study. He served for 4 years, stationed primarily in Alabama, Texas, Japan, and Greece. The structured military environment suited him. Rules, regulations, clear chains of command. Everything had its place. Everyone had their role. It was during this time that his fascination with control began to take on military precision. fellow him airmen remember as competent but unremarkable. He followed orders, kept his area clean, stayed out of trouble. But beneath this facade of military discipline, his fantasies were evolving. The techniques he learned in the Air Force, methods of restraint and interrogation, began to feature prominently in his mental scenarios. What the military taught him about breaking down an enemy, he began to imagine using on helpless victims. After his discharge in 1970, Rader returned to Wichita. He was 25 years old, a veteran with an honorable discharge and a secret that burned inside him like a fever. He took a job at a meatpacking plant, work that brought him face to face with death on an industrial scale. Day after day, he watched animals hang from hooks, their bodies processed with mechanical efficiency. The smell of blood became as familiar as his morning coffee. It was during this period that Dennis met Paula Dietz. She was working as a secretary for the American Legion, a quiet woman who shared his appreciation for order and routine. Their courtship was conventional, even old-fashioned. Church socials, family dinners, walks through Riverside Park. Paula saw in Dennis exactly what he wanted her to see. A stable man with military experience and steady employment. Someone who would make a good husband and father. They married on May 22, 1971, at Christ Lutheran Church, the same church where Dennis would later serve as council president, the same church whose computer would eventually lead to his downfall. Paula wore white, Dennis wore his best suit, and their families gathered to celebrate what appeared to be a perfect match. The bride and groom smiled for photographs, cut cake, danced to songs about love and commitment. But the man who promised to love, honor, and cherish Paula Dietz was already planning his first murder. The early years of their marriage followed a predictable pattern. Dennis found work with ADT Security, a job that required him to install alarm systems in homes and businesses throughout Wichita. The irony wasn't lost on him. By day, he helped people protect themselves from intruders. By night, he studied their vulnerabilities, memorized their routines, noted which windows could be forced, which doors had weak locks. Paula gave birth to their first child, Carrie, in 1973. Dennis appeared to be a devoted father, changing diapers, reading bedtime stories, teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle. But even as he played the role of suburban dad, his fantasies were reaching a fever pitch. The birth of hissed his need for control. If daughter hadn't satisfied anything, it had intensified it. He needed something more than fantasy. He needed reality. On January 15, 1974, Dennis Rader crossed the line from fantasy to action. His target was the Otero family, recent arrivals from Puerto Rico who had moved to Wichita seeking the American dream. Joseph Otero worked at a local manufacturing plant. His wife, Julie, practiced judo and had a reputation for being protective of her 5 children. They were hardworking, religious people who kept to themselves and bothered no one. But Dennis had noticed them. He had studied their patterns, learned their schedules, identified their weaknesses. He knew that the 3 oldest children attended school, while the 2 youngest, 9-year-old Joey and 11-year-old Josephine, would be home with their parents. He knew that Joseph, despite being a former boxer, was smaller than him. He knew that Julie, for all her martial arts training, could be overcome if he struck fast enough. The morning of January 15th was cold and gray. Dennis told Paula he was going to work early. Instead, he drove to the Otero house on North Edgemore Street. He parked several blocks away and walked through the quiet neighborhood, a toolbox in one hand, a gun tucked into his waistband. To anyone watching, he looked like a repairman heading to a service call. He knocked on the front door with confidence. When Joseph Otero answered, Dennis claimed to be having car trouble and asked to use the phone. It was a simple lie, delivered with the sincerity of a man who had spent years perfecting his mask of normalcy. Joseph, being a good neighbor, invited the stranger inside. What happened next would haunt Wichita for decades. Dennis didn't just kill the Otero family. He orchestrated their deaths with the methodical precision of a military operation. He bound them with rope he had brought specifically for that purpose. He moved them to different rooms, separating parents from children, ensuring that each victim's final moments were filled with terror, not just for themselves, but for their loved ones. The brutality was extraordinary, but so was the control. Every action was deliberate, planned, executed with surgical precision. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was performance art. Director with Dennis as both, and star, the Otero family as unwilling actors in a play that ended in death. Joseph Otero died first. Dennis forced him to the floor of the living room, binding his hands behind his back with rope that cut into his wrists. The former boxer struggled, but Dennis had the advantage of surprise and preparation. He pressed a plastic bag over Joseph's head, watching as the man who had once fought professionally clawed desperately at the suffocating material. The sounds Joseph made weren't human anymore. They were the desperate gasps of a drowning man, fighting against an ocean of plastic and terror. Julie Otero was next. Dennis had separated her from her husband, forcing her into the bedroom where he bound her hands and feet. She begged him to spare her children, offering him money, jewelry, anything he wanted. But money wasn't what Dennis craved. He needed something that couldn't be bought or negotiated. He needed absolute dominion over another human being. He placed a bag over Julie's head and watched her die, studying every twitch, every desperate breath, every moment of her transformation from living woman to lifeless body. The children presented a different challenge. 9-year-old Joey was small, frightened, crying for his parents. Dennis tied him up in his bedroom, then placed a bag over the boy's head. But Joey kept fighting, kept struggling, kept refusing to die quietly. So Dennis improvised. He found a rope and tied it around the child's neck, pulling until the struggles stopped, until the room fell silent except for the sound of Dennis's own breathing. 11-year-old Josephine was saved for last. Not saved. Reserved. She was the one Dennis had been thinking about most, the one who figured most prominently in his fantasies. He forced her down into the basement, away from her family's bodies, into a space that felt more private, more intimate. He had brought rope specifically for this moment. He tied one end around her neck and threw the other over an exposed sewer pipe. When investigators later asked Dennis why he had hanged the little girl, his response revealed the clinical detachment that defined his approach to murder. I thought it would be interesting to watch her die. Not passionate, not emotional. Interesting. As if Josephine Otero was a laboratory specimen rather than a child with dreams and fears, and a family who loved her. The basement became Dennis's private theater. He adjusted the rope, studied the angles, made sure he had the perfect view. Then he pulled. Josephine's feet left the ground. Her body twisted and turned as she fought against us. The No Dennis watched every, memorizing every detail, filing away images that would fuel his fantasies for months to come. When it was over, when all 4 members of the Otero family lay dead, Dennis didn't flee in panic. He didn't search frantically for money or valuables to justify the crime as a robbery. Instead, he walked calmly through the house, studying his work. He adjusted the bodies, positioning them in ways that satisfied his aesthetic sense. He cleaned up evidence, wiped down surfaces, made sure he hadn't left anything behind that could identify him. But he did take something with him. Not jewelry or cash, but photographs. Images of the family that he could study later, that could help him relive the experience. He also took items of clothing, small souvenirs that would remind him of this perfect morning when fantasy had finally become reality. The discovery of the bodies came that afternoon when the 3 older Otero children returned from school. Carmen, Danny, and Charlie expected to find their family preparing dinner, helping with homework, settling into their evening routine. Instead, they found a crime scene that would redefine evil for an entire city. The first officers on the scene had never encountered anything like it. Wichita was a quiet, Midwestern city where murder was rare and mass murder was unthinkable. The methodical nature of the killings, the evidence of prolonged torture, the obvious signs that someone had taken pleasure in the family's suffering, all of it pointed to a killer unlike anything local law enforcement had ever faced. Detective Bernie Drawatsky was among the first investigators to enter the house. Years later, he would describe the scene as something that belonged in a horror movie, not a residential neighborhood in Kansas. The bodies weren't just murdered. They were arranged, positioned, displayed like grotesque artwork. Whoever had done this wasn't just killing. He was communicating. The medical examiner's report confirmed what the scene suggested. Each family member had died, suffering prolonged slow-lead agony, while the killer maintained complete control over the situation. The bindings were expertly tied. The positioning of the bodies showed intimate knowledge of strangulation techniques, and the absence of any defensive wounds on the killer suggested someone with military or law enforcement training. But perhaps most disturbing was what the killer hadn't done. He hadn't stolen anything of significant value. He hadn't sexually assaulted any of the victims. He hadn't left evidence of drug use or mental illness. This was methodical, planned, executed by someone who killed not for money or passion, but for the simple pleasure of taking life. The Wichita Police Department launched the largest investigation in the city's history. They interviewed hundreds of people, followed thousands of leads, consulted with experts from across the country. But Dennis Rader had planned too carefully, prepared too thoroughly. He had left the scene as clean as an operating room, taking with him only memories and souvenirs that would sustain him until his next performance. For Dennis himself, the days after the Otero murders were intoxicating. He went to work at ADT Security, installed alarm systems, came home to Paula and baby Carrie, played the role of grieving community member shocked by such senseless violence. But privately, he relived every moment of January 15th. He studied the photographs he had taken, handled the clothing he had stolen, planned improvements for his next performance. The community's fear fed his ego. Neighbors installed new locks, bought security systems, organized watch groups. The very terror he had created became proof of his power, evidence of his ability to reach into ordinary lives and transform them forever. He had become something more than Dennis Rader, mild-mannered security installer. He had become a force of nature, unstoppable and unknowable. But forces of nature need names, and Dennis had been thinking about that. He needed something that would capture the essence of his method, something that would help police and media understand what they were dealing with. The answer came to him with elegant simplicity. Bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. It wasn't enough to kill in silence. Dennis needed recognition, acknowledgement, fame. So he began planning his first communication with the outside world, the first letter that would announce the arrival of something Wichita had never seen before. 3 months after the Otero murders, Dennis Rader was growing restless. The initial thrill of his perfect crime was beginning to fade, replaced by something more dangerous: hunger. Not for food or comfort, but for recognition. The newspapers had covered the murders extensively, but they were treating it as an isolated incident, a home invasion gone wrong, a robbery that had escalated beyond control. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. Dennis knew he needed to educate them. On a quiet afternoon in April 1974, he drove to the Wichita Public Library, the same library where Paula sometimes brought baby Carrie for story time, the same library where he had checked out books on criminology and police procedure, studying the methods used to catch killers like himself. But today, he wasn't there to learn. He was there to teach. He carried with him a manila envelope and a letter that had taken him weeks to craft. Every word had been chosen carefully, every detail selected for maximum impact. The letter wasn't just a confession, it was an introduction, a formal announcement of his arrival on the stage of criminal history. Dennis found his target book in the engineering section, a thick textbook that wouldn't be disturbed for days, maybe weeks. He slipped the letter inside, positioning it so that whoever eventually found it would immediately understand its significance. Then he walked out of the library as calmly as he had entered, another anonymous patron returning to his ordinary life. The letter began with a simple declaration: "I did it." But what followed was anything but simple. Dennis described the Otero murders in excruciating detail, revealing facts that had never been released to the public. The specific type of rope he had used, the order in which he had killed each family member, the way Josephine had looked as she hung from the basement pipe. But the most chilling part of the letter wasn't the confession itself. It was the signature. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK, you see he added again, they will be on the next victim. The letter found its way to police through an anonymous phone call to the Wichita Eagle. A caller, speaking in a measured voice that revealed nothing about his identity, gave precise directions to the library book. When investigators retrieved the letter, they knew immediately that everything had changed. This wasn't a one-time killer driven by desperation or passion. This was someone who planned to make murder his career. The letter sparked panic throughout Wichita. Gun sales skyrocketed. Home security companies couldn't keep up with demand. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. The city that had prided itself on small-town safety was learning to live with fear. For Dennis, the response was intoxicating. He had achieved something remarkable. With nothing more than words on paper, he had transformed an entire community. Thousands of people were changing their daily routines because of him. Police were working overtime, following leads that went nowhere, chasing shadows he had deliberately created. But recognition wasn't enough. Dennis needed more than fear. He needed fresh victims. On April 4th, 1974, less than 3 months after the Otero murders, Dennis began stalking his next target. Catherine Bright was 21 years old, recently graduated from college, working as a secretary at a local office. She lived alone in a small house on South Hydraulic Street, the kind of quiet residential neighborhood where people knew their neighbors and left their doors unlocked. Dennis had first noticed Catherine at the office building where she worked. He had been there on a service call for ADT Security, installing a new alarm system. It was the perfect cover. He could walk through the building openly, study the layout, identify potential victims. Catherine had smiled at him politely when they passed in the hallway. She had no way of knowing that her friendliness had just signed her death warrant. For weeks, Dennis studied Catherine's routine. He knew what time she left for work, when she returned home, which evenings she went out with friends. He drove past her house at different times of day, noting which neighbors were home, which windows offered the best access, how long it would take him to complete his work without being disturbed. But Dennis had learned from the Otero murders. 4 victims had been exhilarating, but also complicated. Multiple people meant multiple variables, more opportunities for something to go wrong. This time, he would keep it simple. 1 victim, total control, perfect execution. On the afternoon of April 4th, Dennis told Paula he had to work late, a service call that couldn't wait until morning. She accepted the lie without question, as she always did. Dennis was a reliable husband, a devoted father, a man who took his responsibilities seriously. If he said he had to work, then he had to work. Dennis parked several blocks from Catherine's house and walked through the neighborhood carrying his toolbox. To anyone watching, he looked like a repairman heading to a late afternoon service call. The toolbox contained his standard equipment: rope, plastic bags, a pistol, and items he would need for cleanup afterward. He had planned to enter through the back door, but when he tested the front door, it was unlocked. Catherine clearly felt safe in her quiet neighborhood, trusting in the illusion of security that Dennis was about to shatter forever. He slipped inside and immediately began preparations. He checked each room, noting potential escape routes and hiding places. He positioned his equipment where he could access it quickly when the time came. Then he waited. Catherine returned home just after 2 in the evening, but she wasn't alone. Her 19-year-old brother Kevin was with her, laughing about something that had happened at work. Dennis heard their voices through the front door and felt his carefully laid plans beginning to unravel. 2 victims meant twice the risk, twice the variables he couldn't control. But Dennis had spent years in the military learning to adapt under pressure. When the door opened and the siblings stepped inside, he was ready. The gun appeared in his hand as if by magic, trained on both of them before they could react. "Stay calm," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just need your car and some money. I'm on my way to New York and my transportation fell through." It was a reasonable lie, delivered with convincing sincerity. The kind of story that might actually happen in a world where desperate people sometimes did desperate things. Kevin and Catherine exchanged glances, fear replacing their earlier laughter, but they seemed willing to cooperate. Dennis directed them into the bedroom, maintaining the fiction that this was simply a robbery. He ordered Kevin to tie his sister's hands and feet, watching carefully to ensure the bindings were tight enough to prevent escape, but not so tight as to cause immediate injury. He needed them conscious for what was coming next. But when Dennis tried to bind Kevin, the young man fought back. Perhaps he sensed that cooperation wouldn't guarantee survival. Perhaps he simply refused to die without a struggle. Whatever his motivation, Kevin managed to grab for Dennis's gun, coming closer than anyone had before to stopping BTK's career before it truly began. The struggle was brief but violent. Dennis had size and experience on his side, but Kevin had desperation and the kind of strength that comes from knowing your life depends on the next few seconds. They crashed into furniture, knocked over lamps, filled the small bedroom with the sounds of a fight that could alert the neighbors. Dennis finally managed to regain control of the weapon and fired twice into Kevin's head, but instead of falling dead, the young man staggered toward the door, blood streaming down his face but still moving, still fighting. Dennis fired again, but Kevin kept going, making it out of the house and into the yard where he collapsed but continued to breathe. The plan was falling apart. Dennis had wanted a quiet, controlled killing that would demonstrate his growing sophistication. Instead, he had gunshots, a wounded witness, and the certainty that police would arrive within minutes. But Catherine was still tied up in the bedroom, and Dennis wasn't willing to leave empty-handed. He pulled out a knife and began stabbing her with frenzied intensity, each thrust driven by frustration and the knowledge that his perfect crime was becoming a desperate scramble for survival. 11 times the blade found its mark, turning the bedroom into a scene of carnage that would haunt investigators for decades. Dennis fled the scene as sirens wailed in the distance, but he had made a crucial mistake. Kevin Bright had survived. Wounded and traumatized, but alive and able to provide police with a detailed description of BTK. For the first time since he began killing, Dennis had left behind a witness who could identify him. The sketch that emerged from Kevin's description showed a white male in his 30s, average height and build, with dark hair and cold eyes. It wasn't a perfect likeness, but it was close enough to worry Dennis. He studied the drawing in the newspaper, comparing it to his own reflection, looking for details that might give him away. But weeks passed, then months, and no arrest came. The investigation stalled as police followed hundreds of leads that went nowhere. Dennis began to relax, to believe that once again his careful planning had saved him. He had escaped justice, but more importantly, he had learned valuable lessons about managing multiple victims and adapting to unexpected complications. The hunger was growing stronger. 2 successful attacks had only increased his appetite for more. Dennis began scouting new targets, studying potential victims with the methodical patience of a professional hunter. He needed someone isolated, vulnerable, completely under his control. He found her in March 1977. Shirley Vian was 26 years old, divorced, raising 3 young children in a small house that backed up to an empty field. She worked nights at a local diner, leaving her exhausted during the day when her children were at school. Dennis had noticed her while driving through the neighborhood. Another ADT service call that provided perfect cover for surveillance. Shirley's situation was ideal from Dennis's perspective. A single mother with no family nearby, working a job that kept her isolated from potential witnesses. Her house was positioned so that screams wouldn't carry to the neighbors, and the empty field behind provided an escape route if needed. On March the 17th, Dennis knocked on Shirley's door claiming to be a private investigator, working on a case involving obscene phone calls in the neighborhood. It was a sophisticated lie that played on every mother's fears about protecting her children. Shirley let him inside, grateful for what seemed like official help with a genuine problem. But once inside, Dennis revealed his true nature. The gun appeared. The mask of normalcy fell away, and Shirley found herself face to face with the monster that had been haunting Wichita for 3 years. Unlike his previous victims, she didn't beg or plead. Instead, she focused on her children, asking only that they be spared from whatever was about to happen to her. Dennis locked the 3 children in the bathroom, telling them to stay quiet and everything would be all right. Then he returned to Shirley, who had accepted her fate with the quiet dignity of a woman who had already survived more hardship than most people ever face. The killing was methodical, almost ritualistic. Dennis used rope to bind her hands and feet, then placed a plastic bag over her head. But this time, he didn't rush. He had learned to savor the moment, to draw out the experience for his own satisfaction. Shirley died slowly, fighting against the suffocating plastic while Dennis watched with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. When it was over, Dennis released the children from the bathroom and left the house calmly. The 3 youngsters, traumatized beyond comprehension, called police who arrived to find another BTK crime scene. The methodical bindings, the obvious signs of prolonged torture, the absence of any robbery motive. All of it pointed to the killer who had been terrorizing their city for years. But this time, Dennis wanted immediate recognition. He was tired of waiting for police to connect the dots, frustrated by media coverage that treated each murder as an isolated incident. Within days of Shirley's death, he called the Wichita police dispatcher directly. "You will find a homicide at 1311 South Hydraulic," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. The call was recorded, giving investigators their first direct communication with BTK. But the voice revealed nothing useful. No accent, no regional dialect, no emotional inflection that might help identify the caller. Dennis wasn't finished communicating. In December 1977, he struck again. Nancy Fox was 25 years old, living alone in a small apartment on South Pershing Street. She worked as a jewelry store clerk, a quiet job that brought her into contact with customers but kept her largely anonymous in the larger community. Dennis had been watching Nancy for weeks, learning her schedule, studying her vulnerabilities. She lived on the second floor of an apartment building, accessible through an outside staircase that provided privacy for what he planned to do. The building was older, with thin walls and neighbors who minded their own business. On the evening of December 8th, Dennis broke into Nancy's apartment through a window he had noticed was often left unlocked. He waited in the dark for her to return from work, positioning himself where he could take control immediately when she walked through the door. Dennis Rader sits in his concrete cell today, serving 10 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. His reign of terror lasted 17 years, claimed 10 lives, and shattered the illusion of safety for an entire community. But perhaps most chilling of all is how ordinary he appeared. A husband, father, church leader who hid unspeakable evil behind suburban normalcy. His story reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like us